They train me to be invisible. To smile at the right moment. To cry at the right moment. To make a man feel seen, truly seen, so that when I moved against him, he would never see it coming. I was good at my job. I was the best they had ever made. And on the night I was supposed to end the most powerful alpha king in the Northern Territories, I stood at an altar in borrowed silk, said vows I didn't mean, and looked into the eyes of a man who looked back at me like I was worth something. I poured the poison anyway. Chapter 1, the dress was too tight. That was the only thing I could focus on as I stood at the back of the Great Hall. The corset pinned my ribs, forcing me to take shallow, careful breaths. It was a distraction, and I needed one. It kept me from focusing on the 300 wolves on the other side of the doors, or the weight of the glass vial tucked against my thigh. The doors opened. I walked. The hall was bright, hazy with the smoke of 1,000 candles. I kept my chin up and my expression soft, the look of a girl who had finally found her fairy tale. I had spent 11 years learning how to be whatever they needed me to be. Today, I was a bride. Kael Dravith was waiting at the altar. He wasn't wearing a crown. My briefings described a tyrant who wore his power like a weapon, but standing there in a simple black tunic, he just looked like a man. He stood perfectly still, watching me approach with a gray-eyed intensity that made my skin prickle. I didn't look him in the eye. I picked a spot on the wall behind him and focused on that. Be Seraphine, I told myself, be happy, be nervous. I wasn't any of those things. I was a weapon with a pulse. The ceremony passed in a blur. When Kael took my hand to slide the gold band onto my finger, his skin was warm and his grip was steady. I didn't flinch. I said the words I was supposed to say, and I heard him say his. Then came the dinner. The reception was a wall of noise, shouting, laughter, and the heavy clatter of silverware. We sat at the center of the high table, side by side. I could smell cedar and rain on him, a scent that didn't belong in a room this stuffy. I waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. Every time I reached for my water, my hand brushed the hidden pocket of my skirt. Beside me, Kael didn't eat. He barely spoke. He just watched the room. Occasionally, he would glance at me, and every time I gave him a shy, small smile. I let my fingers brush his arm. I played the part of the smitten queen perfectly. Finally, the king's beta stood up to give a toast. 300 wolves turned their faces toward the end of the hall, their attention snared by the speech. This was the window. I leaned toward Kael, acting like I was whispering something private in his ear. It's a beautiful night, isn't it? He didn't look away from the speaker, but he nodded. It is. Under the cover of the table and my own leaning body, my fingers moved with practiced precision. I uncapped the vial. I didn't even have to look. I poured the liquid into his wine glass. It vanished into the dark red vintage without a sound. I sat back, smoothing my skirts, and picked up my own glass. I caught his eye and smiled, a real, glowing smile that I'd spent months perfecting in a mirror. To us, I whispered. Kael looked at me for a long, silent second. His expression didn't change, but he picked up the poisoned glass. He raised it toward me, his eyes never leaving mine, and he drank. He finished the whole glass. I felt a surge of triumph. I had done it. The great Alpha King was dead. He just didn't know it yet. For the next 20 minutes, I stayed by his side. I laughed at the right moments. I leaned my head on his shoulder. I was the perfect, loving wife, watching the clock in my head count down his final seconds. Then his hand on the table turned into a white-knuckled grip. He didn't crash to the floor. He just went very still. His breathing became a ragged, wet sound that only I could hear over the music. Slowly, he turned his head toward me. I know what you are, he said. The smile froze on my face. My heart stopped. I've known since before we met today, he whispered. His voice was a rasp, barely audible. I tried to keep the mask up, tried to look confused, but the weight of his gaze shattered it. He wasn't guessing, he knew. I wanted you to know that, he whispered. His eyes rolled back and he started to slump sideways. I caught him. It was an instinct I couldn't suppress. I lunged forward, grabbing his shoulders as his weight came off the chair. His head fell against my collarbone, heavy and hot. His hand gripped mine, not to stop me, but like he was anchoring himself to the world. He leaned into my ear, his breath hitching. Don't go yet. Then the room exploded. Chapter 2, they put me in the Queen's chambers. 2 guards stood outside. A window looked over the courtyard 4 floors down. A bed I didn't sleep in, a fireplace I didn't light, and a tray of food that sat untouched until the meat turned gray. It was a prison with better furniture. I had been in worse but never one this quiet. I sat on the window seat and watched the courtyard. The guards changed every 4 hours. I had timed the rotation. The window latch was a simple spring bolt I could throw in seconds. I had memorized the exits on the walk-in. I could be gone before dawn. I should have been gone an hour ago. The council would expect a report by morning. When I didn't send one, they would send a retrieval team. I had maybe 2 days to vanish before the people who made me came to find out why I was still sitting in a sill-lined cell. I ran the exit route in my mind again. Window, ledge, shadows. I didn't move. My legs stayed heavy, anchored by a weight I couldn't name. The knock came just before midnight. It was light, deliberate. I was at the door before the second rap, my weight balanced, listening to the person on the other side, not a soldier. The breathing was too thin. I opened it. The woman was in her 60s, wearing a healer's apron that smelled of bitter herbs and vinegar. She looked at me with a steady, tired gaze. "Marin," she said, "I tend the king." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. "He's alive," she said. "Barely, but the poison hasn't finished him yet." A cold spike of panic hit my gut. Alive, it wasn't possible. I had measured the dose myself. I had seen him drink. I didn't fail. I wasn't allowed to fail. My reputation, my life, the very reason I existed, it was all built on the fact that when I moved, things ended. But beneath the panic, that tight, suffocating knot that had been twisted in my chest since he whispered stay suddenly loosened. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding finally slipped out. The healer didn't seem to notice. She held out an envelope. "He left this in these chambers before the ceremony," she said. "He told me to give it to you tonight." I stared at the paper. I didn't take it. "Why?" He didn't say. She set the envelope on the small table by the door. "He's still fighting. I thought you should know." She left without another word. I closed the door and leaned my back against the wood. I looked at the envelope. It was a trap. It had to be. A dying man playing a long game to keep his assassin in place. I picked it up. My name was on the front, not Seraphine. It was the name I hadn't used in 11 years. The name that belonged to a girl who didn't know how to kill. The handwriting was plain and direct. I broke the seal. "I know your name, your real one. I know where you came from, and I know what they took from you to make you into what you are today. I'm not going to explain it in this letter. You wouldn't believe it, and I wouldn't ask you to. But I want you to think about one thing before you leave tonight. They told you I burned Ashford. Ask yourself what I gained. The Eastern Valley has no strategic value. It was a village of common wolves who posed no threat to anyone. I lost 3 allies who had family there. I spent 2 years and a fortune trying to find out who was responsible and found nothing I could prove. Tell me, what kind of king burns a village for nothing and then wastes 2 years trying to find justice for it? There is a memorial in the east courtyard. Third garden behind the old wall. I built it 11 years ago. Go and read the names before you decide. Not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to use your own mind. They trained it, but it still belongs to you. The east courtyard gate will be unguarded between 3 and 4. I've seen to it. K. I read it twice. I folded the letter and slid it into my sleeve. The paper was stiff against my skin. I sat back on the window seat and looked at the clock. 2 in the morning, the logic was simple. If I stayed, I would likely die. The council had spent years telling me Kael Draveth was the man who burned my village and killed my mother. They had given me the files. They had given me the training to make him pay for it. I had done my job, and now I needed to save myself. Go to the gate, I told myself. If I left now, I could be in the woods before the sun came up. I could disappear, but I didn't move. I told myself the letter was a trick. It was a lie from a dying alpha who wanted to mess with my head. It was a trap. It had to be, but there was a small, quiet part of me that wouldn't let it go. If he was lying, why talk about a village that didn't matter to his kingdom? I stood up. My heart was beating fast, but not because I was scared of the guards. I was scared of what I might find. I told myself I was going to the garden just to prove him wrong. I slipped out of the room at 2:45. I knew the hallways. I knew where the shadows stayed the longest. I moved quietly, reaching the third garden without seeing a single soul. It was a small, cramped space behind a stone wall. It smelled like wet dirt and old ivy. No one was there. No torches were lit. I found the wall of names. It wasn't a big, fancy monument. It was just a long piece of gray stone set into the garden wall. There were hundreds of names carved into it, row after row. Ashford. 11 years gone. Not forgot. I started at the top. My breath was shaky in the cold air. I ran my fingers over the stone, looking for the proof that Kael was a liar. I wanted to find a reason to hate him again. Then I saw it, Lyra of Ashford. I stopped breathing. The stone wasn't new. The edges of the letters were worn down by years of rain. This hadn't been carved yesterday to trick me. It had been here for a long time. My mother's name. I touched the letters. They were cold. This garden was hidden away in a corner where no one ever came. I stood there for a long time. My fingers went numb against the stone. The council told me Kael was a monster who laughed while my home burned. But monsters don't build gardens for the people they kill. They don't carve names into stone and keep them clean for 11 years. I looked back at the castle towers. They were lit up, restless. If Kael was the tyrant the council described, the halls should have been filled with quiet celebration. The servants should have been leaning into corners, whispering about their freedom. The guards should have been looking for the next man in line to take the crown, but that wasn't what I had seen on the walk here. I had passed a maid in the stairwell who was weeping so hard she couldn't stand. I had seen 2 guards at the end of the hall, their heads bowed, their hands trembling as they held their spears. The healer hadn't looked at me with anger. She had looked at me with a hollow, broken exhaustion. The whole castle was on edge. They weren't waiting for a new king. They were praying for the old one. They loved him. I looked toward the east gate. It was past 3 now. The window to escape was closing. I could hear a distant gate latching shut. The guards would be back at their posts. I didn't run. I stayed in the garden with my hand on my mother's name. I had spent 11 years wanting revenge, but standing there in the dark, I started to realize I might have killed the wrong man. Chapter 3, I kept what I saw in the garden to myself. There was no one to tell anyway. The guards at my door didn't speak, and the servants who brought my meals avoided my eyes. I spent the first night sitting by the window, watching the moon. I thought about the council. I thought about the men who had raised me, the ones who had handed me the files on Kael. They had sat me down when I was 7 years old and told me he was the monster who burned my home. They had given me a purpose. But if they were wrong about the garden, what else were they wrong about? A cold, sick feeling settled in my stomach. If Kael was innocent, then I wasn't an avenger. I was just a murderer. I had spent 11 years preparing to kill a man for a crime he didn't commit. If he died now, I would have to live with that silence forever. I didn't sleep. I just watched the sun come up. For the next 4 days, I stayed in the castle. I wasn't exactly a prisoner, but I wasn't free. Everywhere I went, 2 guards followed exactly 3 paces behind. They didn't stop me from walking the halls or visiting the library, but I could feel their eyes on the back of my neck. I spent my time observing. In a tyrant's house, people are quiet. They walk fast and keep their heads down. But here, the air felt different. I saw a group of younger wolves wrestling in the dirt of the training yard. I saw 2 maids in the kitchen hallway arguing loudly about which spices to use for the winter stew. They weren't afraid of being overheard. They weren't afraid of anything. You can't fake that kind of peace. Not across an entire castle. On the second day, I ran into Damon. The king's beta was standing in the center of the great hall. When he saw me, his entire body went rigid. He didn't just dislike me. He looked like he wanted to skin me alive right there on the stone floor. He knew. Kael might have told him, or maybe he just sensed the rot in the room. He didn't move as I approached. He just watched me with a gaze so sharp it felt like a blade. "The king is still breathing," he said. His voice was a low growl vibrating in his chest. "In case you were wondering when to start celebrating." "I'm not celebrating," I said. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. He was terrified. I could see it in the way his hand twitched near his sword hilt and the dark circles under his eyes. He wasn't scared of a war, he was scared of losing his friend. "If he dies," Damon whispered, "there won't be a corner of this world deep enough for you to hide in." I should have been terrified. I should have been planning my escape while he was distracted, but I just stood there and took it. Staying here was stupid. The council would realize I had failed soon. They would send someone else to finish the job and probably to kill me for being a witness. On the 3rd day, I passed the healer's wing. I heard it before I saw it. A soft, genuine sound. Marin was sitting by Kael's bed, her back to the door. I couldn't see his face, but I could see his hand resting on the blanket. It looked thin and pale. Marin said something about a stubborn mule in the stables, and then she laughed. It wasn't a polite laugh. It was the sound of someone who felt safe enough to be happy, even in a room filled with death. I moved away before they could see me. My chest felt like it was being squeezed by iron bands. On the 4th day, I went back to the memorial. The garden was quiet. I stood in front of the stone and read my mother's name again, Lyra of Ashford. I thought about Kael, barely 20, carving these names while his own world was in chaos. A small boy from the kitchens wandered into the garden carrying a basket of herbs. He stopped when he saw me. He looked at my fine silk dress and the guard standing a few yards away. "Are you the new queen?" he asked. I looked down at the remembering wall and then back at the boy. I gave him a small, sad smile. "I am no queen," I said. He didn't seem to understand the weight of that, but he nodded anyway and went back to his herbs. I stayed there until the sun began to set. I wondered why Kael hadn't sent for me yet. Was he waiting to get stronger so he could execute me himself? I looked at the high walls of the castle. It was too late to run. The council was coming, the king was dying, and I was standing in a garden built for the people I had helped destroy.
Chapter 4. I had been planning this for 8 months. The wedding was just the bait. The real work started the day I got a message from Renée. She lived inside the council's compound and had been sending me information for years. Most of it was small, names of guards, shipment routes, gold moving from one pocket to another. Then she sent me a mission briefing, and she sent me a name. That name was the only reason I didn't have her arrested the moment she crossed my border. I knew the people who survived the Ashford fire. I knew the families living in my East Wing, but I hadn't known that one of their children was still alive. The council had taken her when she was 7 and raised her in a cage. The assassin they were sending to kill me was a woman whose mother's name was carved into my own garden wall. The plan was a massive risk. Voss, the head of the council, never showed his face. He stayed in the shadows and let others do his dirty work. The only way to catch him was to give him what he wanted most. He wanted me dead. So I decided to let him think he'd succeeded. I had already made sure the right rumors were spreading outside these walls. My messengers were fast. By now the whole territory believed the Alpha King was dead and his bride had been executed for the crime. It wasn't hard to convince them. Hundreds of people had seen me fall, and I knew Voss had spies in the crowd who would run straight back to him with the news. If I had caught her before the ceremony, Voss would have stayed hidden and sent someone else. Nothing would have changed, but with me dead and the assassin executed, he would get sloppy. He would come out to claim my lands. My soldiers were already waiting to tear his operation apart the moment he stepped into the light. She was the only part of the plan I couldn't be sure about. I had read her file so many times the paper was soft. I knew they had spent 11 years turning her into a blade. I put the letter in her room to give her a choice, but I didn't know if she would be strong enough to take it. What I hadn't expected was the look in her eyes at the altar. I expected a cold, empty shell. Instead, I saw a woman who was a master of her craft. She was good, nearly perfect. She moved with a grace that was supposed to be a mask, but there was a flicker in her eyes, a spark of something alive that her training hadn't managed to kill. She was beautiful in the way every forbidden thing is. When she leaned in to whisper in my ear, I caught the scent of her, something like cold rain and wild mint. It was the only thing that felt real in a room full of lies. The poison hit me harder than I thought it would. Those last few seconds were a blur of screaming and bright lights, but I remember her face. I remember that she didn't run when I started to fall. She had caught me. I spent 4 days in the dark. Every time I woke up, the news was the same. The plan was working. Voss thought I was gone. He was moving his men into the open, and my soldiers were already capturing them. We were winning the war, but it wasn't enough. Voss would realize the truth soon. And when he did, he would come for the only person who could tell the world what he had done. He would come to kill her so there would be no witnesses left. To the world, she was already dead. If he killed her now, no one would even look for her body. By the 6th day, I could finally sit up. My chest felt like it had been hit by a hammer and it hurt to breathe, but I was alive. Marin came into the room and sat by my bed. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week. "She's been going to the garden every day," she said. I looked at the window. The sun was hitting the floor, bright and steady. "She hasn't tried to run." "No," Marin said. "She stays there for hours, just looking at the stone. The guards say she doesn't say a word to anyone." I thought about her standing in the cold, her hand on the name of a mother she was never supposed to remember. "Tell her I want to see her," I said.
Chapter 5. Marin came to my door and said the king was asking to see me. I told her I would think about it. I waited 4 hours. I didn't want him to think I was still a dog waiting for a whistle. Then I went. I had a list of questions that had been growing for 6 days. He was the only person in this castle who had the answers, and that was the only reason I walked down that hall. Damon was standing inside the room, right by the head of the bed. He didn't move when I entered. He just watched me with his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He looked like he was one word away from ending me. Kael was sitting up. He was pale, and there were dark shadows under his eyes. He moved stiffly, but his gaze was sharp. When I walked in, his eyes found mine immediately. My pulse jumped, a reaction I hated. He looked different without the heavy wedding robes. In the simple linen shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, he looked less like a king and more like a man I had nearly killed. My eyes traced the line of his throat, where the skin was still a bit gray from the toxin. He was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, like a sharp blade hidden in silk. I didn't sit down. I stayed by the door. You went to the garden, Kael said. His voice was rougher than it had been at the ceremony. I went. And I found a wall, I said. I kept my voice flat. Are you going to execute me now, or is this part of the game too? Damon's hand tightened on his sword. Watch your tongue, he growled. Kael held up a hand, a small, tired movement. Damon, it's all right. It isn't all right, Damon snapped, his eyes never leaving mine. She poisoned you. She should be in the pits. She was doing what she was told, Kael said quietly. Go, I'm fine. Damon lingered for a long second, his gaze flickering between the two of us. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod and stepped out. I could still see his shadow on the floor outside the door. I finally sat in the chair, but I didn't lean back. The scent of him, wood smoke, and something clean was stronger here. It made it hard to stay focused. Why am I still alive? I asked. I didn't use his title. I wanted to see if he'd flinch. Because the council wants you dead, he said. And I don't. I felt a flash of heat in my face. The council sent me for justice. They told me you burned Ashford. They said you were a tyrant who laughed while my mother died. Kael didn't look away. The council told you what they needed you to hear so you would become the weapon they wanted. Tell me, Seraphine, did they ever show you the maps? Did they ever explain why a 19-year-old boy would burn a village that paid him taxes and provided his soldiers? They had files. They had witnesses. My voice was starting to shake, and I hated it. I blinked hard, my eyes stinging. I was an operative. I didn't cry. They had people they paid to lie, Kael said. I gained nothing from the fire but a broken territory and a decade of guilt for not being there to save them. Then who did it? I snapped, leaning forward. If it wasn't you, then who destroyed my life? Kael leaned back against the pillows, a shadow passing over his face. You would not believe me if I said it, would you? Try me. You will know eventually, he said. But not from me. You need to see it for yourself first. You need to look at the ruins and ask yourself who truly stood to profit from Ashford's disappearance. I stared at him. The logic I had built my life on was cracking. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, and I wiped it away quickly with the back of my hand, my jaw tight. I was angry at him for being alive, and I was angry at myself for the way my heart was pulling toward him. You're trying to confuse me, I whispered. I'm trying to give you the choice they never did, Kael said. He looked at me, and for a second the king was gone. There was just a man looking at a woman. I saw your name in the files months ago. I knew who your mother was. I wasn't going to let them use a daughter of Ashford to finish the job they started 11 years ago. I gripped the arms of the chair. The council thinks I've been executed. What happens when they find out I'm still breathing? You know what they will do, Kael said. I did know. I had seen what happened to those who failed. I had watched an operative dragged to the center of the compound for missing a target. I had heard the screams of those who were no longer useful. To the council, failure was a crime punishable by death. They didn't leave witnesses. I looked at him, the way the light hit his hair, the steady strength in his eyes despite the pain. I felt a pull toward him that made my skin prickle. I need to go to Ashford, I said. I need to see it. I know, he said. When I'm well enough to travel, I'll take you. I don't need you to take me. No, he said, and a small, almost invisible smile touched his lips. But I'd like to, if you'll let me. I looked at the shadow of Damon outside the door, then back at the man I had tried to kill. We'll see, I said. Chapter 6. We left for Ashford 10 days later, but the fight to get out of the castle gates had taken nearly as long. Damon was not happy. He had spent 3 days trying to talk Kael out of the trip, his voice rising high enough to echo down the stone corridors. At the council compound, I would never have dared to look a superior in the eye, let alone argue with one. But here, the beta stood in the middle of the courtyard, blocking Kael's horse with his own body. You're still pale, you're shaking, and you're taking the woman who put you in that bed into the open, Damon had snapped, his arms crossed over his chest. It's not a trip, Kael, it's a suicide note. Kael had just looked down at him from his saddle, his expression calm. The rumors say I'm dead and she's executed, Damon. We're ghosts. No one is looking for ghosts on the East Road. I had watched them from a distance, hidden in the shadows of the stable door. I was amused despite myself. Back home, an alpha's word was law, and questioning it meant punishment. But Kael just waited for Damon to finish his rant, then leaned down and said something quiet that made the beta finally move aside, grumbling under his breath. When we finally rode out, Kael gave me a tired, small smile. He worries, was all he said. The Eastern Valley was a 2-day ride. We went slowly. Kael moved with a carefulness that reminded me he was still healing, though he tried to hide it. Two of his quieter guards rode far behind us. I watched him as we rode. The council had described a tyrant, a man who ruled through fear and blood. But as we made camp that first night, I saw the way he interacted with his men. He didn't order them around like servants. He helped unsaddle the horses even when his breath hitched with the effort. He shared the same dry rations they did, sitting on a log by the fire and listening as they talked about their families. He looked normal. He treated his guards like men, not tools. He even smiled at a joke one of them made. It didn't make sense. If he was a monster, why were these men so loyal to him when no one was watching on the second afternoon? The path narrowed. Our stirrups brushed, and I saw Kael wince, his hand tightening momentarily on the reins. The poison had left him weaker than he wanted to admit. You should have listened to Damon, I said quietly. You aren't ready for a ride this long. Kael let out a short, dry breath. I wanted to be here. He looked at me, his gray eyes steady despite the pain. I wasn't going to let a little venom keep me from finally seeing this through. I looked at him for a long moment. The council told me you were a monster, I blurted out loud. He smiled. I know, he said, looking back at the road. We reached Ashford the next morning. It was a quiet place, stone houses, a central well, and thin curls of smoke rising from chimneys. It had been rebuilt by the people who refused to let their history be erased. As we rode in, an old woman with white hair was drawing water from the well. She stopped when she saw Kael. Then her gaze moved to me, and the bucket slipped from her hand, hitting the stones with a heavy thud. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at me with a confusion that slowly turned into a terrifying kind of recognition. Ren, Kael said softly, dismounting. She didn't look at him. She walked toward me, her steps unsteady. She reached out a hand, then pulled it back as if she were afraid I'd vanish if she touched me. Is it you, daughter of Lyra? You have her eyes. She whispered. We thought. They said everyone in that house was gone. Her name was Ren. She had hidden in the river the night of the fire. She brought us into her small cottage, put tea in front of us, and began to pull apart the lies I had lived for 11 years. It wasn't a raid, Ren said, her voice hard as flint. And it wasn't the king's order. This village was too loyal to Kael's father and then to Kael. We were a stronghold for the crown in the east. We refused to pay the council's protection taxes because we already had a king we trusted. I stayed silent, my hands cold against the warm tea. The council couldn't buy us, she continued. So they decided to break us. They needed this land for the trade routes, but more than that, they needed to make the people hate the throne. They dressed their soldiers in northern colors. They made sure we saw the king's banners through the smoke as our homes burned. They wanted us to believe our own king had betrayed us. She looked at Kael in the corner, then back at me. The soldiers were led by a man who told us he was there to restore order. He claimed the king had turned on his own people. He fought a mock battle against the very fires he started, making himself look like a savior to the survivors. He used our grief to steal the land and turn the valley into a council territory. And the man leading them? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Ren's eyes didn't flicker. I heard the captains reporting to him. He was the one who personally oversaw the rescue of the children. He was the one who took you, child. She paused, the name feeling like a curse in the small room. Aldrich Voss. He didn't find you. He murdered your family to steal your loyalty, then spent 11 years molding you and other children he kidnapped into a weapon. The truth hit me like a physical blow. The man I thought was my protector had been the architect of the fire. He had destroyed my home. He had stolen my life to expand his borders, then spent a decade training me to kill the man I was born to protect. I pressed my hands flat on the wooden table, trying to breathe through the rage. Ren reached into her apron and pulled out a small object. It was a wolf carved from pale wood. It was rough, one ear bigger than the other. Your mother gave this to me the night before they came, Ren said. She knew the council was circling. She said, if something happens, keep this for my daughter, because she is stubborn and she will always come back for what is hers. I took the carving. It was still warm from Ren's pocket. I closed my hand around it until the wood bit into my palm. Kael said nothing. He sat in the shadows, his tea untouched. He didn't try to fix my grief. He was just there, a steady, grounding presence. I realized then that he was the only person who had ever given me the space to feel my own life without trying to point me toward a target. When we left, Ren held my face in her hands. She didn't say I had my mother's eyes. She just looked at me like I was a ghost finally coming home. You are not what they made you, she said. You just needed someone to show you the door. I looked at Kael, who was waiting by the horses. Yes, I said, I did. On the ride back, the valley turned to gold in the evening light. Kael rode beside me, his hand resting loosely on the reins. I could feel the heat radiating off him. I didn't move my hand, and neither did he. But the space between us felt alive. I looked at the road ahead. I felt the wooden wolf in my pocket. I wasn't being pointed anymore. I was choosing. Chapter 7. He came on a Tuesday, just as Kael said he would. I hadn't been sure. My mind still worked in the language of the council, and in that language, you don't expose yourself unless the objective is already secured. He won't risk his own skin, I had insisted, pacing the war room. Voss is a coward. He sends disposable assets to do the bleeding. He sends someone like me. Normally, yes, Kael said, leaning back against the heavy oak table. But this was his masterpiece. He thinks he's dismantled a monarchy. Men like Voss, they can't help themselves. They have to see the ruin they made. He'll come because he wants to see the look on your face when he tells you it's time to come home. Kael was right. He did come. He didn't come for a war, he came for a coronation. He brought 50 men, young recruits in polished, parade-ready armor who looked like they'd spent more time in a classroom than in the brush, clearly underestimating the strength of this pack. They didn't even make it to the tree line. Damon and his wolves had been ghosts in the high ridges, watching the recruits stumble through the terrain. They didn't need a massacre. They just needed to close the circle. By the time the heavy oak doors of the Great Hall were thrown open, Voss wasn't leading a procession. He was being shoved forward by 2 of Kael's guards, his hands bound roughly in front of him, his expensive silver-lined cloak tattered and dragged through the mountain mud. I watched from the shadows of the high pillars, my heart hammering so hard I felt it in my throat. Kael sat on the throne, looking every bit the king the council had declared a ghost. He didn't rise. He didn't even look angry. He just watched with a terrifying, predatory stillness as Damon forced Voss to his knees on the cold stone floor. Aldrich, Kael said. The name was flat like the strike of a hammer. You're a long way from your desk. Voss's head snapped up. I saw the moment his world turned inside out. He stared at Kael, the man he believed was currently a corpse, and the color drained from his face until he looked like he'd been carved from salt. He looked at the throne, then at the rows of silent, healthy wolves lining the walls, realizing that his 50 recruits were likely already disarmed and caged. Then, his eyes began to hunt. He scanned the hall, the shadows, the corners. He found me. Seraphina, he said. His voice wasn't the cold snap of a commander. It was the voice he used when I was a child, before the rough training began. Child, thank the gods. I heard the most terrible rumors. I thought they had hurt you. I came as soon as I heard the king had succumbed. I walked down the stairs, the wooden wolf heavy in my pocket. Every step felt like I was walking through a nightmare where I was still his tool. I stopped 10 feet away, but I didn't go to Kael's side. I couldn't. The guilt of the poison, the memory of the blade I'd held over his heart, made the floor between us feel like an ocean. I went to Ashford, Aldrich, I said. Voss didn't flinch. He just gave me a sad, patient smile, the one he used when I failed a training exercise and he wanted to show me he still cared. They've confused you, Seraphina. I know what this man has told you. He's an alpha king. His survival depends on his ability to rewrite history. But you saw the banners and the smoke, child. You saw the soldiers who took your mother. You know who the monsters are. I saw your men, I said, my voice cracking before I steadied it. I spoke to the survivors who lived through the fire you started. They remembered the silver-haired man who arrived the next morning to rescue the orphans. They remembered how you claimed the land was forfeit because the people were too loyal to a king who had abandoned them. Voss's smile faltered, just for a second. The warmth in his eyes turned into something sharper, colder. You were a stray, Seraphina. You were a broken thing in the dirt, crying for a mother who was already ash. I gave you a life. I gave you a name that meant something. I turned a tragic little orphan into a legend of the North. You should be thanking me. You didn't save me, I said, looking at his bound hands. You stole me. You murdered my village because they loved the Alpha King, and then you made me thank you for the bread you put in my mouth. Voss looked at Kael, then back at me. The fatherly mask finally shattered, revealing the raw, ugly greed of the supervisor underneath. You think this matters? You think a few weeks in a castle makes you a queen? You're a weapon, Seraphina. I sharpened you myself. You'll never be able to sit at a table without looking for the jugular. You're mine. She's a daughter of Ashford, Kael said, his voice rising, cutting through Voss's poison. Kael walked down the steps, his gaze fixed on Voss. You thought the territory was vulnerable. You thought you could walk in here with 50 boys and take what wasn't yours because you thought I was gone. But my pack doesn't fold, and my wife isn't a piece of property you can reclaim." Voss let out a jagged, ugly laugh. "Your wife, she's a mistake, Kael. Do you think she'll ever look at you without seeing the man she was born to kill? She's a killer. Every time she closes her eyes, she hears my voice telling her where to strike." "Then we'll give her something else to listen to," Kael said. He looked at Damon. "Take him. I want the names of every council contact he has. I want every sleeper cell in the east exposed by sunrise." Damon didn't wait. He grabbed Voss by the collar of his silver coat and hauled him up. As they dragged him out, Voss didn't stop looking at me. His eyes were full of a cold, lingering venom. "You'll come back to me, Serafina," he screamed, his voice echoing as the doors began to close. "You don't know how to be anything else. You're nothing without me." The doors slammed shut, and the silence that followed was deafening. I stood in the center of the hall, staring at the stones. I felt like a fraud. I had a name now, Ayla, but I still felt the ghost of the poison on my fingertips. I felt the weight of the king's life, which I had nearly extinguished. Kael walked toward me. I didn't look up. I couldn't. I was waiting for the moment he realized that Voss was right, that I was just a weapon that had been pointed at his chest. "Ayla," he said softly, "my name." My real name in his voice, and it went through me like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known was there. Not Seraphine, not operative, not the girl they had made, but still the girl who poisoned him almost killed him. "I almost killed you," I whispered to the floor. Kael didn't answer with words. He reached out, and for the first time, he didn't just brush my hand. He took it. He laced his fingers through mine, his warm, rough palm forcing me to look at him. "You were a prisoner," he said, his voice firm. "And today you walked out of the cell. That's the only thing that matters." I looked at him for a long moment. I didn't believe it yet, but I thought that someday maybe I might. Chapter 8. 3 days after they took Voss away, the castle felt different. Noisier, oddly. Doors that had been clicked shut for weeks were now propped open. Voices that had been hushed and watchful now carried down the stone corridors. I didn't have a word for what it sounded like until I had been here long enough to recognize it. It was a castle that had stopped holding its breath. I didn't quite know how to move yet either. I spent those 3 days walking. I walked because I could, through corridors that looked interesting and into the east garden for longer than I had any reason to. In the kitchens, an older woman gave me tea without asking and told me a long, rambling story about a winter 3 years ago when the river froze so thick they had to melt snow just to wash the linens. I didn't say much. I just listened to the sound of a life that wasn't a mission. It felt strange. It felt, underneath the strangeness, like something I might be able to learn. Kael left me to it. No summons, no check-ins, no carefully arranged coincidences, just space. I thought about that more than I wanted to, that a king would give an assassin the one thing she had never had. The right to simply exist in a room without being pointed at something. On the evening of the 3rd day, the quiet became too much and I went to find him. He was on the high walkway along the north wall. He came here most evenings. I had noticed his pattern without trying to, the way you notice weather. He stood with his arms on the railing and looked at the valley. He wasn't performing anything. He was just a man who needed somewhere to stand at the end of a long day. I came and stood beside him. Neither of us spoke for a while. Below, the valley was going dark, the first fires appearing in the village one by one. "Damon came to see me this morning," I said. Kael glanced at me. He said the East Kitchens would like me to come for dinner tomorrow, that it had been discussed among the women there. I paused. He also said, and I could tell it cost him, that I had done well with Voss. He said it to a point on the wall 6 inches to my left, but I'm choosing to count it. The corner of Kael's mouth moved. "That's more than most people get from Damon in a decade." I thought so. We went quiet again. The wind came off the mountain, steady and cold. "I've been trying to work out who I am," I said. "Without the name they gave me, without the target. I keep reaching for the old certainties and they aren't there." I looked at the valley. "I don't know how long that takes." "I don't know either," Kael said, "but there's no deadline on it." He said it as a fact, not to comfort me, just because it was true and he thought I should know it. I looked at him then. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the scarred knuckles on the railing, the particular stillness of a man who had learned to carry weight without making everyone around him carry it too. "The bond," I said. He turned his head. "I didn't know if you still wanted to honor it, given how it started." I held his gaze. "I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to dissolve the contract." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to honor it? I asked you first. I know, he said. I'm asking you back. I looked at the valley, at the fires of the village, rebuilt stone by people who had decided to stay. Yes, I said. I want to honor it. Something shifted in his face. A tension he had been carrying since the altar, quietly, without letting it show. He reached out and took my hand, not a brush, not a graze, but deliberately, his fingers lacing through mine. He looked back at the valley. I don't know who I am yet, I said. It might take a long time. I know, he said. I'm not going anywhere. Below us the castle moved, a door, someone laughing, the ordinary noise of people ending their day. We stood in it, his hand warm in mine, and I let myself stay in the moment without pulling it apart. That was enough for one night. Chapter 9, 3 weeks after Voss was taken away in chains, I learned that Kael couldn't cook. I had come down to the kitchens before dawn because sleep still didn't come easily. I liked the quiet hours, before the castle woke up. Just stone and firelight. I expected an empty kitchen. Instead, I found the Alpha King of the Northern Territories standing over a cold hearth with a pan in his hand and the look of a man who had been genuinely outwitted by porridge. He looked at me. I looked at the pan. This isn't what it looks like, he said. It looks like you've been fighting that pot and losing. He set the pan down. Brennan's wife went into labor last night. Early, he left before anyone was up. Brennan was the head cook, a large, unhurried man who ran the kitchen the way Kael ran his war room, quietly and completely. His wife had been expecting for months. Half the castle had been watching her move carefully between the preparation tables, making quiet bets on the date. I didn't want to wake the kitchen girls, Kael said. They were up late, I thought. He looked at the pan again. I was told it was simple. By who? Damon. The porridge was burnt at the bottom and raw in the middle. I wasn't sure how he'd managed it, but I wasn't looking at the pan anymore. I was looking at the table. 2 bowls, 2 spoons set out straight, and a small clay pot of honey between them, the kind kept on the back shelf in winter where it wouldn't harden. He had no reason to know it was there unless he had gone looking for it. He had been trying to make breakfast. For both of us. Before I was even awake, I laughed. It came out sudden and unguarded, bouncing off the kitchen walls before I could do anything about it, and it surprised me enough that I laughed again at the surprise of it. Kael stared. Then that quiet, almost invisible smile arrived on his face. He turned away before it could fully settle, carrying the ruined pan to the basin with the composure of a man conducting a dignified funeral. There it is, he said, almost to himself. What? Nothing. I took the pot from him, rinsed it, and started again. He didn't offer to help or to leave. He settled onto the edge of the preparation table and watched me work. I found the oats, the salt, the right flame. Outside the narrow window, the sky was beginning to go from black to a deep gray blue. When I put the 2 bowls on the table, the ones he had already set out, he looked at his for a moment without speaking. You didn't have to, he said. You already put the honey out, I said. Seemed a waste. He looked up at me, then back at the bowl. He reached for his spoon and didn't say anything else. We ate shoulder to shoulder on the same bench because the stools on the other side were too far and neither of us moved to close the distance any other way. Our arms brushed once when he reached for the honey. Neither of us shifted apart afterward. Outside, the sky turned from gray to pale. Somewhere in the east wing a door opened and closed. The castle was beginning to wake, and we sat there a little longer than we needed to. The weeks had settled. I was finally learning to stop waiting for the blow. Mornings were mine. I walked. I read in the library in a low chair that caught the morning light. I visited the East Garden and stood with my hand on the memorial stone. I wasn't grieving anymore. I just wanted to be there. It felt like the right thing to do, so I kept doing it. The kitchen women had adopted me without asking my permission. Petra, the oldest of them, had decided I needed feeding and treated it as a straightforward problem to solve. She put plates in front of me and talked about the village, the seasons, the internal workings of the castle's domestic life with the confidence of someone who had been paying attention for 40 years. I didn't say much. I listened and ate and found that sitting in a warm room with people who wanted nothing from me was something I hadn't known I needed. One afternoon, she asked me to sit with her while she sorted dried herbs into jars, a long, quiet task that didn't need 2 people, but that she had decided needed company. I sat across from her and helped separate stems from leaves while she talked about a summer 3 years ago when the rains came late and the whole valley had to share what was left of the grain stores. The king rode out himself. she said, not looking up from her work. Went village to village. Not to make promises, just to see. Just to know what people had and what they needed. She set a bundle of time aside. He came back with mud on his boots and stayed up half the night with the quartermaster working out how to stretch the reserves. She glanced at me, brief and direct. I'm not telling you something you need to know. I'm just telling you. I didn't answer. I kept sorting the herbs, but I thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. Afternoons, Kael and I overlapped in the war room. It hadn't been arranged. It had just started happening, and then it was already a habit. I would come to study the eastern maps, tracing the old council supply routes, comparing the terrain against what I had seen on the road to Ashford. He would already be there. We worked at opposite ends of the long table, and neither of us felt the need to fill the quiet. We argued sometimes. He had firm opinions about Eastern border strategy that were wrong in a specific and measurable way, and I told him so on the second afternoon. I had braced without realizing it for what men in his position usually did when they were contradicted. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Show me." So I did. I laid out the maps and the numbers, and he listened without interrupting, and when I finished he said, "You might be right." "I am right." I said might. 4 days later, the reports came in from the Eastern relay stations and proved it. He read them, set them down, said and moved on. I decided to count it and let it go. There was an afternoon toward the end of the second week when the war room had gone cold because the fire had burned low and neither of us had noticed. I had been working through a stack of old council correspondence seized from Voss, cross-referencing names against the Eastern maps. Slow, tedious work. I had been at it for 2 hours when I looked up and found Kael watching me, not the general ambient attention I had gotten used to. This was more direct. He was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, and he was just looking at me, and when I caught him at it, he didn't look away. "What?" I said. "Nothing," he said. "You make a face when you find something." "I don't make a face." "You do, your jaw moves." He demonstrated a small, subtle shift that was embarrassingly accurate. I looked back at the papers. "I'm working." "I know," he said. And he went back to his own documents, and that was all. But I was aware of him for the rest of the afternoon in a way that made concentrating considerably more difficult than it should have been. I came back from the village one afternoon to find a horse saddled and waiting at the east stable gate, not the gray mare they had been giving me, which was steady but slow and pulled left on the uphill. This was a dark bay, one of the better animals, the kind the senior guards rode. Already fitted with the correct stirrup length, adjusted shorter than standard, the way I needed them. Her saddlebag had a water flask and a folded oilskin for the weather, which had been threatening rain since morning. No note, no groom standing by to explain it. Just the horse, ready, stirrups set to my height, saddled by someone who had paid attention. I stood there for a moment. I had seen Damon that morning in the corridor outside the war room. He had walked past me without stopping, without looking at me, his jaw set the way it always was, hands behind his back, same as every other morning. No different at all. I took the reins and rode out. I didn't mention it to Kael. I wasn't sure I had the right words for it yet, only that it meant something, and that Damon had done it the way that suited him best, without acknowledgement, without warmth, without giving me anything I could thank him for directly. It was the most honest thing he could have done. That night I couldn't sleep. This wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that by the third hour of staring at the ceiling, I had run out of patience for it. I got up, pulled on my cloak, and went out into the corridor without a destination. Walking helped. Moving through the quiet castle at night was something I understood, the low torches, the distant sound of the watch changing, the way the stone held the cold and gave it back slowly in the dark. I went to the library because it was close and I thought I might read. But when I got there, the room was already occupied. Kael was sitting in the low chair by the window, my chair, the one that caught the morning light, though at this hour the window showed nothing but black and the faint reflection of the single candle burning on the table beside him. He had a book open in his lap, but he wasn't reading it. He was looking out at the dark, and he didn't hear me come in because I had spent 11 years learning to move without sound. I stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked tired in a way he didn't allow himself to look during the day. His shoulders were different, not the deliberate stillness I was used to, but something looser and more private, the posture of a man who believed he was alone. There were papers on the table beside the candle, covered in dense writing. He had been working before the book, or maybe instead of it. I should have left. I stepped into the room instead. He turned at the sound of my foot on the stone. For a moment, he just looked at me, and I looked back, and neither of us said anything about the fact that it was past midnight, and we were both awake, and neither of us apparently had anywhere better to be. Couldn't sleep, I said. No, he said. I crossed to the shelves, found something that looked long and dull enough to be useful, and sat in the chair across from him, closer than my usual one. He watched me settle. He didn't say anything about it. For a while we just sat there. The candle burned steadily between us. Outside, the wind moved against the old glass in low, intermittent gusts. I opened the book. He looked back at his. "Do you do this often?" I said after a while. "More than I'd like," he said. "What keeps you up?" He was quiet for a moment. Tonight it was the Eastern Settlements, 3 villages under council taxation for the last 6 years. They paid double the rate because they didn't know it had changed. He turned a page without reading it. "We're fixing it, but it takes time, and in the meantime, those are real people who spent 6 years paying for something they didn't owe." "You can't fix everything at once," I said. "No," he said, "I know that. But it bothers you anyway." He looked up at me. "Doesn't it bother you? You spent years as part of the system that was doing it." It wasn't an accusation. His voice was even, and he was asking a real question the way he always did, directly, without softening it, without edge. "Yes," I said, "it bothers me." He nodded and looked back at the window. We sat in that for a while. The fire had burned down to low orange coals. I wasn't reading. He wasn't either. The books were just something to hold. "The horse," I said eventually. He didn't look up. "What about it?" "Someone saddled a better horse for me this afternoon. Correct stirrup length. Oilskin in the bag." Kael turned a page. "The weather has been unpredictable." "It has," I said. He said nothing else. I said nothing else. Something in the quality of his stillness told me he knew exactly whose idea the horse had been, and that he was not going to say so, and that this was the correct approach. I looked at the side of his face in the candlelight, the scar along his jaw. The tiredness around his eyes that had nothing to do with the poison and everything to do with what it meant to carry a territory full of people. He was 30 years old and had been doing this since he was 19, and from everything I had seen he had been doing it well, and it had cost him something steady and ongoing that he never talked about. I thought about the files the council had given me. The portrait they had built, a tyrant, cold and self-serving and brutal. I had studied those files for months and believed every word. I looked at him now, in a library at midnight with a book he wasn't reading and papers covered in calculations about tax rates in villages he would probably never visit. "I'm sorry," I said. He looked up. "For the poison, I know it doesn't fix anything, but I haven't said it directly and I should have." He was quiet for a moment. The candle flickered in a draft and steadied again. "You were doing what you believed was right," he said. "That doesn't make it right." "No," he said. "It doesn't, but it means something that you can see that now." He held my gaze. "I'm not carrying it against you. I need you to know that." I looked at the coals, deep and red and slow. "I don't know how to do this," I said. "I meant the castle, the mornings, becoming someone who lived somewhere. But I also meant the other thing. I didn't clarify." He seemed to understand both. "You're already doing it," he said. "You've been doing it since you didn't run." I looked back at him. In the low light, his eyes were darker than usual, and he was looking at me with the full attention I had stopped trying to deflect. And for a long moment, neither of us moved, and the distance between us felt very small and very deliberate. Then he looked back at his book. "Get some sleep," he said. "You're useless in the war room when you're tired." "I'm not tired." "You've been staring at the same page for 20 minutes. I looked down. He was right. I closed the book and stood up, and when I reached the door, he said quietly, "Ayla." I stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for the apology." I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I went back to my room, and this time when I lay down, I slept. The following morning, I came down to the kitchen before he did. I didn't plan it. I just woke early, the way I always did, and I went downstairs and the kitchen was empty and cold, and I lit the fire myself and found the oats and the salt and the right pot, and I started. I found the honey on the back shelf where it always was. I put it on the table. I set out 2 bowls, 2 spoons straight. I was standing at the hearth when I heard his step in the corridor, unhurried, the particular weight of it that I had learned to recognize without looking. He came through the door and stopped. He looked at the table. At the 2 bowls and the honey pot between them, he looked at me. I turned back to the pot. "It'll be ready in a few minutes." He didn't say anything. He came and sat on the bench, the same one we always used, and he waited. Outside the window, the sky was doing something pale and gold at the edges, the first real light of morning pressing in. When I put the bowl in front of him, he wrapped his hands around it and looked down at it for a moment. "Ayla," he said. "Don't," I said. "It's just porridge." He was quiet. I sat down beside him, close enough that our arms touched, and I picked up my spoon. We ate without talking. The kitchen filled slowly with the smell of wood smoke and oats and the cold, clean air coming in under the door. Somewhere outside, a bird started up, then another. The castle was waking. His hand, when he reached for the honey, covered mine on the table for just a moment. Not by accident. He didn't move it away immediately, and neither did I. Then he poured the honey, and we kept eating, and neither of us said a word about it. I thought about the altar. The vial. 11 years of being a weapon and being told it was justice. I thought about my mother's name in the stone in the garden. I thought about Wren's hands on my face and the wooden wolf in my pocket and the library last night, and I'm not carrying it against you, and the horse at the gate with the stirrups already set. I reached into my pocket with my free hand and felt the carving. One ear larger than the other. Worn smooth where it had been held the most. I put it on the table between us. Kael looked at it. He didn't pick it up. He just looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something that means more than it appears to. Then he looked at me. I met his eyes, held them. Let him see whatever was there without trying to arrange it into something safer. He reached out and took my hand properly this time, his fingers between mine, his palm warm against mine on the table in the early morning light. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. Outside the window, the sky had gone from pale to gold. The village was waking up below. Somewhere in the east wing, Petra would be starting her day, and the guards would be changing at the gate, and the castle would do what it always did, move forward. Keep going, full of people living their ordinary lives. I held his hand on the table with the wooden wolf between us and the porridge going warm in the bowls and the morning coming in through the window. I was still becoming whoever I was going to be. But this, right here, this kitchen, this table, this man, felt like the place I was going to become her. That was enough. That was everything.